After delivering an absolutely roller coaster of a story in Red Dead Redemption 1 with John Marston, Rockstar changed gears for the sequel and put us in the shoes of a new protagonist, Arthur Morgan. It was a move that paid off in spades, with Arthur being the perfect foil for the story Rockstar wanted to tell with Red Dead Redemption 2, and instantly becoming one of the best video game protagonists we have ever seen. Though Arthur was, of course, the leading man, John Marston wasn't left by the wayside. He was still very much integral to the story, to the point where much of the game's second half and Arthur's titular redemption hinged on John and his survival. More than anything else, the excellently written relationship between Arthur and John, Red Dead Redemption 2 also gave us a deeper insight into the latter. Replaying Red Dead Redemption 1 after the second game makes for an interesting experience, because having the knowledge of what happened to John before the events of the first game and how that changed and shaped him gives you a much better understanding and appreciation of that character. But how exactly did Rockstar do that? There's definitely a case to be made that Arthur not having been mentioned by John even once in the entirety of Red Dead Redemption 1 is a glaring inconsistency, especially in light of everything those two went through together. That flaw, though, is easy to forgive not just because we understand the logistics of Rockstar's situation and the release timings of both games, but also because John's character development in Red Dead Redemption 2 more than makes up for it. When Red Dead Redemption 2 begins, more than a decade before the events of the first game, the John Marston that we find is in many ways quite different from the one we had known since 2010. Where he was consistently undeterred in the face of trouble and admirably competent in Red Dead Redemption 1, at the beginning of Red Dead Redemption 2, he's more prone to making mistakes. He's not incompetent by any means, and he's still handy in a pinch, but it's clear that he's not yet the hardened outlaw we knew him as in the first game. More importantly, it's his disposition towards his family, toward Abigail and Jack at the beginning of the second game, that shows us how far he has to go to get where he was in Red Dead 1. The most obvious difference is his indifference towards his son, Jack. He hardly ever acts like he's his father, shirking any and all responsibilities and duties that would ordinarily fall on him. What Red Dead 2 does to show how that changed deserves a lot of praise, because it's Arthur Morgan who proves to be the catalyst that brings about that change in John. Throughout the game, the two of them have plenty of conversations, some of them more adversarial than others, about the way that John needs to treat his family, and the game's excellent writing shines through in these moments once again, because not only do these scenes serve the purpose of juxtaposing John's personality in both games, they also hold weight for Arthur, who, having lost his son, not only resents John for having what he doesn't, but is also frustrated that he doesn't understand its value. As such, these scenes are doubly impactful. The gradual change that we see in Arthur and John's relationship, triggered by Dutch's multiple failings, proves to be the perfect combination to make John realize what's important in his life. That, combined with Arthur's sacrifice to help him escape with his life and get back to his family, does an excellent job of making us understand John's devotion to Jack and Abigail in Red Dead 1. Of course, knowing how it all ends for the Marstons makes Arthur's already heart-wrenching sacrifice even more depressing. Red Dead 2, however, also deserves praise for not portraying John's relationship with those two with rose-tinted glasses even after Arthur's sacrifice. John's relationship with Jack is still cagey at best, while he and Abigail have their fair share of issues as well. But Red Dead 2 not only successfully fleshes out John Marston's past and backstory, it also needs to be recognized for how expertly it uses his character. It goes without saying that coming off of the first game, fans would want John to be front and center, regardless of whether or not he was the protagonist, and Rockstar could have very easily gravitated toward that, even if it was on a subconscious level. But Red Dead 2 shows a surprising amount of restraint. As with all things, its story takes its time to build momentum and doesn't let itself indulge in fan service by throwing the spotlight on John until it knows it has earned it. Just look at how sparingly he's used in the first several hours of the game. He's a secondary character at best during the prologue, while all throughout the Valentine arc, he's barely even present. John comes into the story more prominently when the Braithwaites kidnap Jack, and from that point up until the gang gets the boy back from Angelo, he's featured as a prominent character. Following that though, once again, John recedes into the background, at times almost completely, and only comes back to the forefront when Dutch starts unraveling and things come to a head. Red Dead 2 spends all that time dedicating time to other characters, wrapping up other story arcs, and only once it's satisfactorily tied a knot over all of that stuff, it lets itself give into fan service, and when it does, rather than feeling cheap, it feels like an excellent payoff thanks to all of the preceding build-up. The fan service I'm referring to is, of course, the game's massive epilogue. Much like the rest of the game itself, the epilogue is a slow burn, starting off with plotting pacing and gradually ramping things up. And while it's an excellent experience in and of itself, especially because of how effectively it caps the massive game's sprawling narrative, for fans of the first game in particular, it is an absolute treat. From remixes of beloved tracks from the first game to scenes calling back to iconic moments, it's a non-stop 8 to 10 hour long buffet of fan service and nostalgia. Being able to play as John once again for that entire duration and seeing him really come into his own, especially during his final ascent up the mountain as he faces down Micah, is one of the most exhilarating experiences you'll ever have in a video game. When it comes to protagonists, Red Dead 2 has its cake and eats it too. It introduces us to a completely new character in Arthur Morgan, and over the course of several dozen hours builds him up excellently. Then, after wrapping up his story, it lets us play as John Marston once again and reminds us just why we loved him as much as we did in Red Dead 1. There's no telling if we'll ever be stepping into his shoes again in the inevitable Red Dead sequels, but even if we don't, we can at least be satisfied with the excellent way Rockstar made use of him in 2 games. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.